Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome those of you in the classroom here and those of you joining us online to the Tsujimoto Perspectives in Global Development Seminar Series. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Cox. Dr. Cox is a professor and a department chair at Dartmouth College, just up the road, as he said, just a short 5-hour drive away. So he had a nice drive down here through some good snow and didn't seem to rattle him too much. He likes snow, grew up in upstate New York in the snow belt. So I appreciate that too, because I did too. And so we both love winter. And so we're not complaining about this good weather that we're having lately. Dr. Cox is an environmental social scientist specializing in environmental governance with an emphasis on community-based natural resource management. He's conducted field work on local resource management in the southwestern US and in the Dominican Republic. His first book, called Common Properties, The Theory and Practice of Environmental Property, explores the significance of environmental property rights across academic disciplines, cultures, and types of environmental policy. And I'd like to add that he additionally co-founded and co-hosts a podcast called In Common, which I've asked him to mention a little bit at the end, give it a little bit of a voice to, because I'm particularly interested in that piece of his bio. It's really wonderful to have you here. Thanks so much for joining. Please welcome me, everybody.
Yes. So normally I would have you ever know what a Slido deck is? It's this really cool thing where you all could show what you thought the answers to a certain quiz would be. We're going to do the analog version of that before I give my actual talk. This talk is going to be about property rights. It's going to be about my book, in which I ask the question, what are property rights and why do they matter? Before we dive into that, I'd love to just each of y'all spend like 20 seconds on your own asking yourself what you think a property right is, what an environmental property right is, like what is the image that dominates your understanding of that idea? So just like spend like 10, 20 seconds. What's the context? What arguments have you heard? What do you associate with it, right? Because it's a very complicated topic, and often our understanding of complicated topics become dominated by like one particular association, one particular image. So now that you've done that thinking, does anyone want to volunteer what came to mind when I said that? Environmental property, environmental ownership. What do you all think it means? I also like to do this. I've gone to a bunch of different universities to give this talk, and I'm always finding it interesting, like what the answers are based on like where I am, et cetera. Yeah.
There are some people encourage about permaculture, like a permaculture cultivation the land with like a wind harvest.
Okay.
Solar.
Okay.
Self-supply, like self-sufficient without any government, like electricity or
okay.
like a well.
So ownership has something to do with building something on it as a way to claim that you own it, or is that not what you're thinking?
Owning the land, like for example, you own 100-acre of land.
Mm-hmm.
But then this land, you completely practice like an environmental awareness.
Okay.
Consider.
Okay.
His role.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And the other ones? Yeah, go ahead.
It's by state or not. It's actually part of the have-in theory.
Yep. Very important question. When we talk about ownership of land, one of the key questions is who owns? Right? Naive theories of property often assume that maybe it's individuals or the state, et cetera. And there's lots of different options about who could own the land, which of course is important for their own agency of potential owners, right? And everything else. Let's get like one or two more before we launch in. Any other ideas? Yeah.
Partitioning of plots of land that's recognized by the government.
Okay. And how is that a property right story to you? Can you say a little bit more? I mean, it's kind of self-evident, but like, why is that an interesting example to you?
Because the government generally has the right to grant property rights. And therefore, when it's recognized by the government, it legitimizes the ownership of that fund.
Okay. That does bring us to another important question, which I do talk about in the book too, is like, is the government the ultimate source of legitimizing land rights? Can you have informal land rights that still matter in some ways? Because you find those everywhere, right? But I feel like particularly in, and I'm gonna use this term in quotes, like Western context, right? We often assume that formalizing rights is what makes them real in some way, right? But that's obviously not always the case. One more? Yeah.
As you work in water, so I'm thinking about water rights and their association with land, either formal, informal, and if like the water and the right to use it as a farmer, but also can you sell it different than the land, which is not particularly good.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about this idea of, we call it alienability, whether you can sell what you own or not. That's part of what we call the bundle of rights, which represents this idea that saying that you own something can mean many different things, right? For the first ingredient is that you could be many different types of actors. You could be a state, you could be a market, you could be an individual, but your claims themselves could also vary, right? You could have access, right? That means I have physical access to this room right now. I'm being here. That's how I'm expressing that. I don't have exclusion rights. That would be the right to prevent other people's access, right? And I certainly don't have alienability here. I can't sell this room. Right. So, but we're going to talk about how we think about certain aspects of the bundles of rights today as well. So that's great. That's a great introduction. So it's not hard to find in kind of popular literature. This is in the Atlantic. This is in a website called The Hill. Arguments about the importance of property rights. Property rights are going to save the environment. Property rights are fundamental to a free society and to conservation. And my issue with all these arguments is that they beg the question, what is a property right in the first place? Right? I'm not willing to assume, based on my own experience even before writing the book, that we all necessarily agree on the answer to this question. What does it mean to own something? And if we can't all agree on the answer to this question, then we can't all mutually, completely understand what's being talked about here. These arguments are implicitly using a certain form of property right. Right? They have something in mind. They tend, if you read them, they tend not to actually make it very explicit what they mean by property rights, but they do have something relatively specific in mind. But there's a lot of diversity about what we could mean by property, all right, beyond what might be meant by authors like these. So given these questions, right, that are posed to us from these types of articles, but also just from the diversity of opinions in classes like this about what it means to own something, what a property right is about, led me to want to write this book to explore how different fields have answered this question of what a property right is. That's the objective of this book. I'm not looking for a property panacea. I'm not looking for kind of the answer to all our problems, the way I think sometimes, again, property rights are framed. What I'm looking for is a way to document the diversity of ownership and rights systems that we find across cultures and political systems, and what's good and bad about them. So that's the goal of the book, just to kind of frame it. So, you know, I've said that this is the question of the book, so let's start by actually asking ourselves, like, what is an environmental property right most basically? I hope you enjoy these graphics. I worked hard on them. So a right, let's start with what a right is, right? And famous scholar Dan Bromley from University of Wisconsin argued that a right is a fundamentally social thing, that there's no such thing as a right in a social vacuum. If it's just me in the universe, I don't really care about my rights. Right, but a right is a claim that you make to your community, to your society, to your government, right, about your right to take an action or achieve an outcome. So you have someone making a claim, and you've got some kind of audience to that claim. Okay, that's fine. Okay, a property right adds another ingredient. A property right is a social claim, so it's still a right regarding something that is owned. So now we've got this, whatever this is in the middle, we're claiming something about that to someone else. So now we've got three ingredients to this relationship. Environmental property right, which is the subject of this book, is a property right where the environment is the object of the property claim. So I'm claiming something to someone else about what I can do or outcomes that I can be insured of for this tree that I own, for this forest that I own. I know this is, you know, this is purposefully aggregated and abstract at this point. Okay, that is what I think an environmental property right is. That basically, all right? Put this basically, this type of arrangement, environmental property rights are completely ubiquitous. I would you could try to find a social setting where no one's making social claims about property of any kind. I don't think you'll be very successful. Some anthropological work has argued that property is, in fact, this broadly stated, a cultural universal, that you can't find cultures and systems, human systems, that don't have some version of someone doing this, which is potentially a strong claim, right? Particularly for anthropologists. But notice the second part of this. What varies, so I'm making a statement about generality, right? Property rights are everywhere. What varies is how these arrangements are established and expressed, right? So I haven't answered lots of questions about how this plays out, right? It could play out by variations in who the property claimer is, could vary by the bundle of rights that are actually being claimed, and it could vary by the audience as well. These two I'm going to talk a lot more about than the third. For example, the property claimer, the person making the social claim, could be an individual, right? Sometimes when we hear about like arguments about property rights, I often think we assume that we're talking about individual level property rights. We could have common property, which means ownership by a community. Not as common in the US, but we still have things like HOAs here, which are a good facsimile of it. State property, which itself is quite diverse, right? When we hear state, we often think like Washington, but state also includes things like local townships, right? So lots of diversity within these categories as well. More recently, there's been this movement towards the rights of nature. Actually, raise your hand if you've heard of the rights of nature movement. Okay, so the third of you. So this idea is it is a legal and political movement designed to kind of do what it says, to give rights of nature back to nature and have advocates for nature be legibilized in the legal system. Some famous cases include the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's maybe the most famous one, but arguably the Endangered Species Act in the United States from, I think, 1968. Something like that, is arguably a rights of nature approach, where it says that we will protect these endangered species regardless of economic cost, that these species have standing. Legally, that's what ultimately matters a lot of times, is whether someone has standing. And so this is really a whole new kind of approach towards how do we think about who actually has rights, who's making the property claims. So already a lot of different ways any kind of property right could go, right? Then we add more complexity, right? Because there's no such thing as just owning something, right? Unless you have a common understanding of what it means within a particular context. I just said, right, you could have access. In some ways, access is the most fundamental human right, right? Because if you can't access something, then you are excluded, right? So we're all exerting the right to access right now, right in this room, and we exert it as we walk around campus. Appropriation means that I could, as I leave, I could take one of these chairs, right? Which I won't, right? But in my context, I mostly work with fishers and farmers. Appropriation means taking waters out of rivers, taking fish out of the lake, right? It's appropriating something, it's extracting something from the environment for yourself. So more of an impact, right, than access usually. Development is potentially even greater, right? So it's physical development. Maybe it's building irrigation infrastructure. Maybe it's building a whole new house, right? Often the legal process to get development rights is much more extended than getting these other rights. And for good reason, it's often more environmentally impactful. Exclusion and alienability. So we talked about a little bit about these before, right? And again, from the Western legalist perspective, these are kind of first among equals in terms of what it means to say you own something, right? Exclusion means that if I own my house, I can exclude other people from coming into my house. And I think there's a logic there, right? We're going to talk about exclusion and what's good and bad about it. But I want to say, like, for a lot of us, there is a solid intuition. Like if I couldn't prevent people from walking into my house, I'd be pretty upset and would violate my sense that I own the house. Or whatever it is, right? My 12-year-old nephew would be pretty upset if he thought that he couldn't exclude people from his bedroom, right? Because it's my bedroom, right? So there is, I think, a psychology behind this that we need to understand and appreciate. Alienability is kind of a awkward word for it. It's called alienability because it's about your right to alienate yourself from what you own, right? So it's your right to sell whatever you own. And that could be your house. It could be fishing rights. You could sell other rights. This is often seen, particularly in well-developed market economies, to be kind of part and parcel to what it means to own something. And a lot of debates across cultures and misunderstandings are particularly about alienability. If you sell something, if you have a right, does it mean that you can sell it or not? The only thing I'll say about the audience is that in my field, we worry a lot about, it's funny, I asked you to not have that screen on. I'm managing to walk entirely in front of this screen. Legibility is really about how much does the local community, the local state government, the federal state government understand the rights claims of locals? How are those rights claims legible and interpretable to outside actors, given their own legal or social frameworks? Is an important question for us always to ask. So I've made this general claim that this type of relationship, I think, is quite general, if not universal. But I've made the same claim that the way it is implemented varies tremendously across political systems and across cultural systems. And so once we have, I'm trying to get to a point where we, at least in our minds, can appreciate that there's a lot of diversity of ways in which people think about what it means to own the environment. And there's really two approaches that we could take. One is you can look for what's the best way. What's the optimal solution to this space? Is there one best way to own the environment? It might be obvious already that I don't think that's the best way to go here. My answer is more to document the presence of different institutional arrangements and explore what's good and bad about them. Because there is no perfect system, there is no kind of panacea that's going to save us if we just find the perfect way to engage with the environment. So what we really need to do is to document what we see around us and kind of catalog that diversity so we have an understanding and way of making sense and valuing that diversity when we encounter it in the world. So that's where I wanted to go here. And what I'd like to do next is really talk more about these two rights, which I've mentioned again from the Western perspective are seen as kind of first among equals in terms of what are the most important property rights to have. And I kind of want, what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement this approach with those two rights. I'm going to try to document the diversity of ways in which exclusion and alienability actually can be implemented and talk about their strengths and weaknesses to kind of show you what I do with the rest of the book as well. So let's talk about exclusion and alienability. So, exclusion. A lot of it relates to this idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? Most of you have probably heard about that. I see some vigorous head nodding. What's the story of the tragedy of commons and how does it get to its exclusion? Tragedy of commons starts with, okay, we've got some cows on a pasture and we ask ourselves, what's the nature of the environment? Well, it's subtractable. So those cows are eating up that grass, right? Subtractable basically means exhaustible, right? If I take a fish out of the ocean, Andrew can't take that same fish, right? There's a kind of zero-sumness to our interactions there. We can use something up. It's non-excludable. Those cows can go somewhere else and keep doing what they're doing, right? Non-excludable means that it's difficult to exert rights of exclusion to prevent people from using a resource. And when you combine those two factors of the environment, which define a common pool resource, a common pool resource is a resource that has these two properties. This is highly vulnerable to the tragedy of the commons, or what really we should call the tragedy of open access. And they're all realizing that's what's happened to them and they're upset. The results of this, we refer to this as a failed collective action problem, really. Right, a collective action problem, as I put helpfully in the corner, is a divergence between individual and collective interests. The collective interest here would have been in the long-term sustainability of the shared resource. The individual interest was eating more of the grass in the short run. We could have a whole lecture series about collective action problems. They are really ubiquitous for humans and for all species. I mean, when a bird gives a warning call that some predator is in the area, like they are solving a collective action problem because, right? The collective action problem is we want to hear when the predator's around, but no one wants to do it. They want a free ride on someone else who's going to give the warning call. So the person who's giving the warning call is acting like a public good provider for the rest of the birds. This is a concept that will take you far if you've got a lot of kind of intellectual curiosity across species as well. Okay, reset. Primary response to this is to create boundaries to the right of exclusion to enable reciprocal behavior between people and the environment. to put fences up. It's one thing you could do. The model for why I think this helps, right, is what's happening. You're exerting a rights claim, and then if you can be assured that no one else can come in and also exert a rights claim or use this environment, you can be better assured of the benefits in the future of that environment. So if you steward the environment, if you invest in that environment, you can be assured through the right of exclusion that other people won't free ride on that stewardship or investment. So it helps to create more of what I call a kind of extrinsic reciprocal relationship between people and the environment. I think this is actually the core of most arguments about why property rights are helpful for the environment. It boils down to this, is that it helps create a stronger connection between people's welfare through these benefits and their actions towards the environment, right? And I like to pause here and say, like, I think this is extremely important. Like, I think this argument is largely valid and pretty intuitive, I think, to understand that that's why you'd want to have that kind of arrangement. Again, we haven't said anything, this story doesn't say anything about who this is, right? Or what these rights are. So still, even with this logic that I'm kind of claiming is quite generalizable, there's a lot of diversity about how that logic could be implemented across cultures, across political systems. Let's talk about the problems of exclusion. All right, because we just talked about the good part, right? Problems of exclusion. Number one for many people is inequity, right? So this is a map of the Northwest Dominican Republic where I've worked for 10 years with a local NGO called Agrofrontera. We work right along the Haitian border. So we got Cuba there. We've got Hispaniola here. The star is where I work, so the northwestern corner of the Dominican Republic. I work with this NGO that itself works with farmers and fishers trying to deal with tragedies of the commons, trying to take less fish out of the ocean, trying to deindustrialize their farming practices. And this is, this zooms in on parts of that study site. You have the town of Manzanillo, and this is the Dominican-Haitian border here, right? This is actually fairly well-preserved mangrove forest. And this is Montecristi, which is the capital of the province of Montecristi. And then you have here Cayo Siete Hermanos Wildlife Refuge, which, you know, I always tell different versions of this joke, right? But if it looks like a paper park and quacks like a paper park, it might be a paper park, right? Anytime you see a square on a map, you want to ask yourself, like, is this actually enforced? And no, this is not. Someone drew this in a room, and it's not well enforced. One question I like to ask when I'm lecturing to my own students is, who do we think owns this? The Dominicans or the Haitians? Haitians are over here, Dominicans are here. This is another aspect of property, right? Like, what criteria do people use to make property claims? There's actually a really fascinating book that I read for this called Mine with an exclamation point, which documents all the different ways people use physical proximity, time to support their claims for rights. Well, one is, you know, you could argue that the Dominicans are closest, and physical proximity is one of the main ways people use, main like justifications people have for claiming something, right? Everyone is sit in a seat, right? That I think a part of you thinks you own at least for the next 40 minutes. You own it because you're sitting in it. No one else is more proximate to that seat than you, right? So that's an extreme version of that. The Haitians, on the other hand, could say, well, hey, if I just go straight north, right? Maybe the boundary just goes like this. I should still be in Haiti. Can't argue with that either. This is what the border does, right? Pretty strategically, potentially, right? So Haitians often find themselves in Dominican waters, and Haitians are often blamed for problems of overfishing. There's a lot of historic ethnic and racial tension between Dominicans and Haitians. So here we have this conflict, and we have this exclusion, right? Now, in particular, you have exclusion of a relatively impoverished, and certainly when they're in the Dominican Republic, politically vulnerable group of people. So I say this to emphasize also that exclusion, I just said exclusion is important if we want to actually help people want to steward the environment, right? But this one lesson here is that exclusion is not a technical solution. It's not something that's apolitical, right? Because if you're going to exclude, you're going to have someone who's excluded, right? It's in the definition of the word. So how we feel about exclusion, even if we think that it's a necessary governmental process, is going to probably vary a lot by who the identity of the individuals and the people who are doing the excluding and being excluded. So that evaluation, I don't think is generalizable very much, because it really does depend on the nature of the people who are there. So to me, this does not feel, I understand that, okay, from the Dominican perspective, they don't want Haitians coming in and maybe free riding on conservation efforts. I also am pretty torn about the negative livelihood impacts on the Haitians that are occurring because of this exclusion. That's one concern. Second is that exclusion can also motivate physical development as well as stewardship at the expense of the environment. So how does this work? Well, you could build these fences, but a lot of times what happens is that building these fences, this has been documented particularly in South America and in the Amazon, is that rights claims are used to incentivize, to guarantee that once people clear the land, they can keep their cows on it after they've gotten rid of the forest, right? There was nothing in the story that I told you before about property rights that said people will necessarily, if they have property rights, steward the land. They might invest in it and they'll still want to invest in it and develop on it for future benefits, but those benefits might come at the expense of the environment. So again, we're complicating the story of what exclusion might be doing. A third exception, which I really like, sometimes flexible boundaries are needed. For example, in pastoralist systems. Again, if you're thinking you're a part of a group, if you all imagine you're a part of farmers and you have a shared aquifer, right? And you're worried about depleting the aquifer. What's your first thought maybe if 20 more farmers come down the road and they have their pumps and they're ready to use your aquifer? You might think, oh, this is going to be a problem for this resource, right? Like we need to exclude these people. And if you don't have much of the aquifer, maybe even more concerned, right? There's lots of things that could exacerbate this psychology. So from this perspective, where you think of outsiders as free riders, what you want are maximally rigid boundaries. Don't let anyone else into this group. We've got a good thing going. And I think this is generalizable beyond natural resources. Many groups have to deal with just like, how do we deal with exclusion? In pastoralist systems, the logic is almost flipped on its head. All right, so how does this work? Well, in pastoralist systems, I don't know if you saw that really cool animation. There's a sun and then there's a drought, so the weeds go away, all right? What is pastoralism? It's a cultural adaptation to resource scarcity. There's no water, and so what's the first thing you do? Well, you need to be able to move. So instead, what you do is you put your resources on hooves, aka you get some cows that can move. Why do you need to move? So that you can move to where there's water and from where there water isn't. So you need to be mobile, right? Does that make sense? The other ingredient is that you need flexible boundaries because where you're going to move is going to be owned by someone else. And so pastoralist systems often will have a core property that's owned by the group, but then we'll have very flexible boundaries around that about who can access their land and who else's land they can access. And again, some pastoralist scholars have argued this is because the fundamental problem these folks are trying to solve is not the tragedy of the commons, because they don't, in fact, impact the environment the way that we might normally assume resources do, particularly if our image of resource use is very industrialized and extractive. So a lot of these folks are not necessarily damaging the land, and their fundamental problem is moving around to get enough livelihood for themselves. How do they get enough information about where the resource is and how do they get to that resource? One point to make is that flexible boundaries are less legible to external actors. There's a long history documented by folks like James Scott that's documented that centralized states often try to centralize mobile populations to make them essentially more governable. So that's another challenge that systems like this face. Another issue that comes up is really going back to the nature of the problem. Remember, we started with this idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? And that started with the nature of the problem, which is that the environment is subtractable and non-excludable, right? That technical words we used. I think one conclusion you come to from a study like this is that subtractability is less about the environment per se and more about the nature of the relationship we have with the environment. Subtractability, exhaustibility is not something that the environment has necessarily. It's more about how we relate to it ourselves and with what technology. So that's another kind of rephrasing what pastoralist scholars have said, is that the way they use the environment, they use it in less subtractable ways that impose the tragedy of the commons less. And I'll skip this bit, even though I would love to get to it, but there's other stuff I want to make sure I get to. Specifically alienability. So now I'm going to use most of the remainder of my time to talk about alienability in the same way I just talked about exclusion. Again, the idea here is documenting the diversity of these fundamental ideas and talking about how there can be both good and bad, so we have a full picture of what it means to own the environment and the impacts it can have on us and the environment. So the right of alienability grants the right to exchange, which is a form of reciprocity, right? Markets are great. You give me money, I give you fish. That's great. You know, under certain assumptions, it's a win-win, right? I bought coffee this morning. I was definitely happier after I bought that coffee than before. Miracle of the market. All right. Economic framings associate market exchange with efficiency, which is broadly aligned with the discourse I was just promoting. More strongly, sustainability. If you're interested in this argument, we can talk afterwards. I don't agree with it, but it's out there that you actually need to be able to sell something in order to actually want to steward it. There's a lot of assumptions in there, I think, that are usually wrong, but that argument is out there. Leasing of rights, right? So it's not, we often assume that if something's sold, it's sold permanently, but particularly in the natural resource context, I've worked with farmers in Colorado that often lease water rights amongst each other. And for a lot of them, the ability to lease rights from some other system gives them access to a resource that they otherwise wouldn't have available to them because their own system doesn't have water. And I hope that sounds similar to the pastoralist example, right? It's basically, you're using institutions to access backup resources at a time when your resources are scarce. So alienability actually can play a similar role as flexible boundaries in this way, which I think is interesting. The dark side of alienability, where it can really go wrong. What happens when something is for sale? What happens when something is commodified and divorced from the context of its production? Alienability can lead to consolidation. Someone can buy up everything, right? There's the specter of consolidation and inequity. And it can lead to the alienation of traditional and indigenous users of natural resources by facilitating access for outsiders. And this has happened in catch share programs, otherwise known as individual transferable quota programs, which is a very popular fisheries policy that have had, there is evidence that in some cases they've had positive ecological outcomes. There definitely is evidence that they have crowded out a lot of traditional users of the fisheries where they're implemented. And what ends up happening is you've got these international actors that come in, buy out the local users, and you really do have the social alienization of traditional users from the land and water that they used to depend on for their livelihood, but also for their sense of identity and well-being. So this has been a major controversy of catch share policy, certainly among certain academic circles, which I think we should take seriously as well. So again, all of this can be true at once, right? The main thing, again, I always try to tell my students is that your job is not to decide whether you're like pro property rights or pro exclusion, right? The intellectually most honest stance I think you need to take is to be like, look, this sounds pretty great. This sounds pretty bad, right? And your job isn't to kind of average the two and figure out what your stance is on this, even if that's like an efficient way to talk to someone about it at a party, right? Like that's not your job. Your job is to like consider this complexity in your head and then keep it there. The final journey I want to take you on for this relates to ideas of kinship and reciprocity. And then we'll show how these tie back to property rights. And this is where we depart from more of the, again, so-called Western perspective. I say so-called because, again, there is a Western and non-Western perspective. That itself is a dichotomy that oversimplifies, and I'm aware of that even as I further reinforce it in this talk. Kinship and reciprocity are the two primary mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. You talk to evolutionary theorists, evolution biologists, a lot of them will say it all boils down to, I will help you if you will help me, because it's costly to help you, so it needs to benefit, you need to then benefit me, and then we can keep on going, tit for tat, right? There needs to be some way that my trading partners, my cooperative buddies, benefit me after I've benefited them. There are harder and softer versions of this. Some people argue that have a theory of friendship as a kind of soft reciprocity, where if I help a friend, it does matter to me that if, like, they benefit me at some point, but it's not like we're keeping a ledger, right? It's not like I'm like, oh, well, you know, you didn't buy me that burrito 2 months ago, Ted, right? That's actually anathema to what we think of friendship, but still there's some kind of, there is a relationship between friendship and reciprocity as well. Kinship, right? So kinship is kinship. It promotes altruistic behavior from parents to offspring, most fundamentally, as parents view their offspring as being intrinsically valuable. Human beings also have cultural kinship, which is really interesting and quite ubiquitous. Most of us, if we think about it, have experienced this, right? My friends' children often refer to me as Uncle Mike. I'm not their uncle, right? But it's this, I'm being made family in this, right? And many different cultures have many different ways of doing this, but it's a very common practice. What does it do? It extends the number of people that we're willing to be cooperative with, right? It extends that kinship psychology to people we're not genetically related to. It's one of the dominant features of our species is how cooperative we are. And this is one of the ways in which we do it. So this is one of my big aha moments when I was doing research for this book, this convergence between evolutionary theory and indigenous environmental studies. Because both of them, in fact, emphasize the importance of kinship and reciprocity in facilitating altruism and cooperation. If you read descriptions of many, I won't say all, but many traditional indigenous communities and how they view the nature of the environment and the relationship with it, you will see kinship and reciprocity in very prominently, right? There's this idea that we owe things to the environment, that the salmon are our kin, that my grandparents, you know, my ancestors live in these trees. You hear these ideas that arguably are a further extension of these same psychologies to non-human relatives and kin, right? So it was fascinating to me that these, I'm fairly confident that these literatures don't talk a lot to each other, right? And so for me, it was like, oh my gosh, there's this convergence across these contexts about what it takes to actually promote certain types of behaviors. I want to tie this back to, I've mostly said this, but kinship and reciprocity with nature, I view it as really like a cultural adaptation and creates a kind of intrinsic value. The argument that you also see in the indigenous environmental literature is that the importance of these psychologies is that they promote cultural stewardship, right? So you're kind of cooperating with the land reciprocally and because you perceive it as kin. So I love giving this shout out. I give it at the end of every book. I talk about someone else's book at the end of my book talk. It's got a book called Kaiulu, Gathering Tides by Mahana Blake Vaughn. She's a Native Hawaiian and talks, it's a great book to read for many reasons. One of them is that she talks a lot about the Native Hawaiian language. And one of the terms she uses in the book is called kuleana, which means reciprocal rights, which I found to be very powerful because property rights has a lot of baggage, right? To say, well, everyone has property rights. In some ways, yes, that's true. In some ways, no, because that term has baggage because some dominant groups have claimed certain versions of what it means to own. All right, and so to have a different vocabulary, at least available to us from another culture, not that I want to start using this all the time because it's not my term, right? But kuleana means to own means to be obliged, right? It means those are the same thing. And so to me, this takes this observations here and says, look, there's a fundamentally different way we could think about what it means to own. And I thought that was very powerful. If you're into this, and it's really interesting to you, read the book. And I'll mention the podcast now too. So one of the things I did in writing this book is I interviewed many of the authors whose work I was using in my podcast, which was great. You know, you email someone and say, hey, do you want to talk to me? First of all, academics love hearing that, right? Anyone here likes hearing that. And I would say, hey, I'd love to like talk about your work and I'm going to include it in my book. Can I talk to you about like some questions I have about it? So it was a really kind of efficient way to do this. I interviewed Mahana and it was just like, it's just a fantastic interview. It opens with like her reading poetry to me and I'm just like scrambling with my notes being like, okay, I still have like analytical questions for you, but this is amazing. So it was really great. Very charming and engaging and satisfying. So what does this mean? So we've gone from rights claim for benefits. I think what happens is that we have reciprocal rights claims is kind of almost how we're thinking about it, right? So the environment, we perceive the environment is actually exerting rights claims on us. And hopefully some of you all are tying this back to the rights of nature movement that I mentioned earlier in the talk is embodying some of these ideas. In some ways, the legal system and the rights of nature approach is playing catch up with what a lot of local and traditional folks have been thinking about for a long time. Finally, I mean, one final thing is that, again, this is not strictly Western and non-Western. There are Western folks like Aldo Leopold who have espoused very much these same ideas. The land ethic is very much about reciprocal obligations to the environment. And the final idea, again, is this: the intrinsic value that I think that these psychologies create do lead to a more holistic care for the environment. And Mehana in her book talks about how many Native Hawaiians care for the local coasts in a way that they wouldn't if they didn't have these psychologies and the intrinsic value available to them. So again, still about property rights, right? But a farther afield, certainly for me, coming from where I was disciplinarily, than one might think would count as a form of ownership. So some just final conclusions. I like to give the table of contents and actually show you what we've pretty much done. I more or less walked you through the first 3 chapters of the book, right? So we have tragic commons, boundaries and exclusion, kinship and reciprocity. We talked a little bit about bundles of rights, but we only dipped into it a little bit. The final part of the book really answers this question of what does it mean? Who is owning the environment? Right? Is it nature itself? Is it individuals? And why does that matter? Also talks about this idea of a panacea, because a lot of property rights arrangements are used kind of as a panacea, like, oh, we just need individual property. Oh, we just need the state to take care of it, right? They get promoted as if like that's kind of the only answer still. So in that chapter, I talk about how do you spot panacea thinking in others or in yourself when you kind of fall in love with a certain approach to environmental ownership. Finally, restatement, right, just for emphasis, right, the struggle to understand institutional diversity and to meaningfully document complexity and contradictions is both theoretically and socially important. And this is the salesman part. You can use this QR code to order the paperback edition from Columbia University Press. You can use this as a discount. But also, the full text is probably available at your university library. It's been available at most universities that I've done this talk at. So you can just download the PDF. I care more about you reading it than the other option. So. And so that's it. Thanks for your time and attention.
Great, well, thank you for leaving a few minutes after your presentation. Today, I think it's probably best if you just take questions from the audience, will be most efficient.
Sure.
So I would ask everyone to speak up loudly because we know that it takes time to microphone. Pass it around. So if you stand up with your question and speak to the whole audience, we can save a little extra time. Questions for Michael?
I can also hang out afterward if folks.
So, when you talk about
You stand up and talk loud.
like private loud, okay, so, so I want to know the approach is more from the legal point of view or from the social point of view, like the ownership of the environmental ownership, like so in terms of the environmental ownership in more in the legal part. I just want to the approach of which was
There's always this tension between ethical and legal rules. And this is one of the big challenges. I feel like I just made this louder. But
That's good.
one of the big challenges that the rights of nature approach is having to shoehorn those perspectives into a largely Western legal framework, which is not really built around recognizing that nature could have rights and that certain people could believe that. So there are ongoing tensions in that way. I mean, the Wanganui River is a pretty extraordinary example. What it really is co-management between a local Maori tribe and the central government. And so a lot of the success of that has ended up being how well do more informal local actors work together with larger, more powerful legal, like formal actors. And so it's successful as a certain type of rights of nature, but it's really successful because of the details of the case and how people were able to work together across groups that all sometimes would be very antagonistic. That's one way to like think about your question. I know it's not like answering fully like how do we think about the legal landscape of this. I mean, that was one part of my what made this book it is, and not another one is that I'm not a legal scholar. I'm kind of like half political scientist, half anthropologist. A legal scholar writing this would have written a very different book.
So this is more like a suggesting on a social setting, like more like a
Well,
ideal.
my goal is for people to read this and for it to help them think about what we could do. Yes, but I don't think that you do that by offering like empirical evidence of the diversity of things we see in the world. Right. So I don't think it is normative and it is suggestive, but it's not only that. It's also quite descriptive. And my talk was quite qualitative, but in the book, I'm summarizing like lots of quantitative arguments, large N studies that compare different types of property arrangements, et cetera. So there's a lot in there other than like, okay, I'm trying to push people in a certain direction. In some ways, I'm trying not to push people in one direction, right? To think like, oh, this is the way.
So what is the response to your book? Like most of the people from the social setting or from the legal or political setting respond to your book? What kind of response you are getting after you publish your book?
Well, they say they like it. You know, you never know. That's what they say to my face.
Say like who?
Oh, who is responding? Oh, a mixture of, I mean,
Can we
Yeah.
talk to him afterwards? I want to make sure there's time for others to ask questions. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this, your concept of alienability that you described,
yeah.
and the relationship between that and responsibility.
Mm.
So, for example, if I own a flock of cattle and they consume a lot of water, if I can sort of separate myself from that cattle by selling it, can I also separate myself from responsibility for like how much water they consume or how much methane gas they release into the environment?
Yeah, I mean, you're reminding me of one of the main challenges that alienability poses for local communities. So I used to work with this group of Hispanic communities called the Sequias in northern New Mexico. And one of their main social challenges was the alienability of water, that they could sell water rights outside of their community. And that meant that folks in that community could alienate themselves from their property, but in so doing, alienate themselves from complying with the norms of their community because they no longer depended on it. So it's quite socially disruptive when that happens, right? Because suddenly, oh, well, and also they're potentially selling it for a lot more money than they've ever seen because some rich person from California is going to use those water rights to build a fancy new house up the hill. So again, like markets are extraordinary and often lead to win-wins, but when it's talking about disrupting kind of communal property arrangement, it can be very disruptive because it allows people basically to exit the system. And speak like, I can't tell them they shouldn't do that, right? Like some 18-year-old who's like, hey, I don't want to live here. I want to go live in the city. And so I'm going to sell what I just got. It's like, I have no right to tell that person they shouldn't try to get some coding job that's going to pay them.
There's a question here, then a question here. Okay.
So I'm curious what your take is. Oh, thank you for coming. I'm curious what your take on right to roam. Right now, in France, I know there's a lot of discussion about right to roam. They're looking at the more Scandinavian models of that. So I know it's sort of very counter exclusion. I'm curious if you think that'd be a good thing to implement or sort of like maybe not so good.
Yeah, I think those are kind of solely two different questions. One is, what do you think about it where it is? And then the second is, do you think it should be expanded somewhere else? I can roll with it. I like it. Like the idea that folks, it's a flexible boundary, right? It's this idea that people can go onto each other's land for specific purposes. You could also think of it as a kind of almost usufruct right. I know it causes controversy. I know sometimes landowners don't like it. But again, it's not like the folks who are doing the roaming, the account that we have of them is not that like they're being pernicious or degrading the land. They're folks who are like, just want to kind of walk around the country they live in, which to me, like I can usually get on board with more than like, you know, and again, I'm anchoring in certain images, right? Because I'm not an empirical expert in this space. So I'm more for it than I'm against it for sure. Like applying it to other contexts, because I know it from England, and I know it's like similar things are in like Scandinavia. How much you could implement it in the US, I think it would, at the state level, like it is pretty great in some ways that we're a federation, right? Like just listen to a podcast about how Washington State started their own cap and trade program. Sweet. So at the state level, right? Like I could see it being more effective.
One question here.
Thanks, Dr. Cox. Two-part question. One is animals seem to have some concept of property rights, saying that they can be territorial. Since you mentioned evolutionary biology, I wonder what lessons we can draw from that. And then the second part is, how does this change when companies are involved, when it's not sentient beings, but companies and entities that are legal, but not human beings?
Okay, fantastic questions. Yeah, I used to lead an off-campus program in Southern Africa, and so I'd watch lots of territorial animals. My psychological response was that it felt affirming about how natural it is because again, I feel like in part because of appropriate responses to the enclosure movement and the dispossession that many people have faced through the language of property rights, they, for good reasons, have kind of a bad name. For me, it was kind of like rediscovering that this is actually something that is almost like not quite universal, but widespread across humans. This is something that we do need. We do need to kind of figure out what our relationship with nature is. Feeling a sense of belonging, feeling a sense of ownership is an important part of that. And it doesn't need to be, it can separate itself maybe from a lot of the kind of colonialist baggage, ideally. The second question was?
Companies, legal corporations owning like land as opposed to human beings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I worry about companies in the same way I worry about states. In some ways, I think like huge companies are not that different from states. And so you start to have some of the same concerns about representativeness and accountability. I mean, states are actually sometimes, they're even like, they're less accountable than a state because they're hypermobile. So lots of social issues certainly come into play. The other main argument I would say is that when people say like, oh, we need if people argue for privatization, what does privatization mean? Privatization just means that the state's not going to own it. That's the most technical, it just means not the state, right? Because if it's public, it's the state. If it's private, it's not the state. And like, if by privatization you mean like I want individuals to own things, then maybe I'm on board, although I like common property. But if you're using arguments for privatization to smuggle in the idea that corporations should own stuff, that's a fundamentally different thing. To me, the category of private versus public is often more misleading than it is useful, because you're lumping together things that just like have nothing to do with each other. Like I am not Walmart, right? But we're both private. So that's another thing I would take from there.
Thank you very much. Fantastic.